Sometimes the things our fathers leave behind tell stories we never knew they had. Sometimes those stories can save us when we need it most. Elliot Granger's father died and left him broke, fighting for custody of his daughter, and the strangest inheritance imaginable, a rusty Soviet submarine sitting in a Virginia marsh. Everyone said it was haunted. Everyone said to stay away. But when you're desperate, you explore every option. Inside that submarine, Elliot and his 8-year-old daughter Lena found a hidden safe. Not just any safe, one filled with secrets that could be worth hundreds of millions, the kind of secrets that powerful people kill to protect. But what deadly secret was his father protecting all these years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the salt marshes like old memories, thick and persistent. Elliot Granger stood at the edge of his inherited property, staring at the impossible sight before him. 300 yards from the nearest navigable water, half swallowed by 40 years of Virginia wetland growth, sat a submarine. Not some pleasure craft or research vessel. A genuine Cold War Soviet submarine, its conning tower piercing the marsh grass like a monument to forgotten conflicts. The rusted hull stretched nearly 300 feet through the cattails and wild rice, its dark metal skin mottled with decades of weather and neglect. Vines had claimed the periscope housing. Small trees grew from cracks in the deck plating. Nature had tried to digest this intruder, but steel and stubbornness had won the long battle. "Daddy, it looks like a sleeping whale," Lena whispered, her small hand finding his calloused palm. At 8 years old, his daughter possessed the kind of imagination that saw magic where adults saw problems. Her mother, his ex-wife Sarah, would have called it foolishness. Sarah, who'd taken their comfortable suburban life and traded it for a lawyer husband with steady income and predictable weekends. Sarah, who'd filed for full custody the moment Elliot lost his engineering job at Newport News Shipbuilding. "The Leviathan," he said, remembering the name from the inheritance papers. "That's what the locals call it." The legal document had been as cryptic as it was official. Property deed, maritime salvage rights, and a handwritten note in his father's careful script. "The truth is in the deep places, son. Lena will show you the way." Elliot hadn't spoken to his father in 15 years. Thomas Granger had vanished from their lives when Elliot turned 18, leaving behind only vague explanations about important work and protecting those who matter. His mother had died believing her husband was simply another man who couldn't handle the weight of family responsibility. Now, standing in this primeval marsh with foreclosure papers in his back pocket and a custody hearing scheduled for next month, Elliot wondered if his father had been protecting something else entirely. "Can we go inside?" Lena asked, tugging on his work jacket. "Not yet, sweetheart. We need to be careful." The submarine rested at a slight angle, its port side settled deeper into the marshy bottom. Access appeared possible through what looked like an emergency hatch near the stern, though decades of corrosion had sealed most obvious entry points. As a marine engineer, Elliot understood the structural challenges. As a desperate father, he understood the necessity of exploration. Elliot Granger. He turned to find a woman approaching through the marsh grass, moving with the confident stride of someone familiar with unstable ground. She appeared to be in her late 30s, with prematurely grey hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and intelligent eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they observed. She wore field clothes, waterproof boots, canvas jacket, and the kind of multi-pocketed vest favoured by researchers and naturalists. "I'm Katya Vulkov," she said, extending a dirt-stained hand. "I maintain the botanical survey for this marsh system." Her accent carried traces of Eastern Europe, softened by years of American life. She studied the submarine with familiarity, not surprise. "You've seen this before," Elliot said. "I've been documenting the ecological impact for 3 years. The Local ecosystem has adapted remarkably well. The hull provides substrate for unique plant communities, and the interior chambers have become habitat for several species of marsh birds. Lena peered around Elliot's legs, fascinated by this woman who spoke of the submarine as if it were a natural feature of the landscape. "My name is Lena," his daughter announced. "That's our submarine now." Katya smiled, the expression transforming her serious features. "A submarine is a heavy responsibility. Do you know how to operate one?" "Not yet," Lena replied solemnly. "But Daddy used to build ships, so he can probably figure it out." "Used to," Elliot emphasized, "before the shipyard downsized." The conversation felt surreal. Three adults and a child discussing submarine ownership while standing knee-deep in marsh grass as if such inheritance were commonplace. But then, nothing about the past month had followed normal patterns. "The local families have stories," Katya continued. "They say it appeared overnight in 1983. Coast Guard searched it, found nothing, declared it abandoned. Too expensive to remove, too remote to matter. Eventually, people stopped asking questions. But you didn't stop asking questions." "I'm a scientist. Questions are my profession." She paused, studying his face. "You have your father's eyes." The statement hit like cold water. "You knew my father?" "Thomas Granger came here every few months. Always alone, always carrying flowers. He would spend an hour walking around the submarine, then leave without saying much. I assumed he was a veteran, perhaps dealing with war memories." Elliot felt the familiar anger rise in his chest. Even in death, his father remained a mystery. A man who honored the memory of a Soviet submarine, but couldn't be bothered to attend his grandson's birthday, parties, or his son's wedding. "Did he ever go inside?" Elliot asked. "Not that I observed, though I wasn't always here to watch." Lena had wandered closer to the submarine during their conversation, drawn by some invisible magnetism. She stood near what appeared to be an access hatch, her small hands pressed against the corroded metal as if listening for heartbeats within the hull. "It's not empty," she called back to them. "What do you mean, honey?" Elliot approached, followed by Katya. "It's humming. Very quiet, but it's humming." Elliot pressed his ear against the same spot. At first, nothing, then, barely audible, a low-frequency vibration that seemed to emanate from deep within the submarine's belly. Not mechanical exactly, but not natural either. "Emergency systems," he murmured. Some submarines were designed with long-term power cells for essential functions. Drainage pumps, atmospheric controls. After 40 years, Katya sounded skeptical. "Soviet engineering was built for permanence. They over-engineered everything, especially military hardware." Lena had found what looked like a maintenance hatch near the waterline. The heavy steel cover showed signs of having been opened recently. Scratch marks around the locking mechanism, oil stains that hadn't yet been washed away by marsh water. "Someone's been inside," Elliot observed. "Your father," Katya said quietly. "He had keys." The revelation shouldn't have surprised him, but it did. His father, the absentee parent who missed every important moment, had somehow possessed access to a Soviet submarine sitting in a Virginia marsh. The contradiction made his head spin. Why didn't he tell anyone? Why leave it to me in a will instead of sharing whatever secret he was protecting? "Maybe he tried to tell you," Lena said, holding up a small notebook she'd found wedged behind. "The hatch mechanism. Maybe this is his way of talking." The notebook was wrapped in waterproof plastic, clearly placed with intention. Elliot's hands shook slightly as he unwrapped it. The pages inside were filled with his father's handwriting, technical diagrams, coordinate notations, and what appeared to be historical research notes. "Operation Poseidon," he read aloud. "Submarine K-219, commissioned 1962, decommissioned 1983. Crew complement 73. Final mission classification, eyes only." The writing continued for pages, dense with technical specifications and maritime law citations. But it was the final entry that made Elliot's breath catch. "The safe is protected by 3 locks, physical, electronic, and emotional. Lena has the 3rd key. She always did. I pray she'll forgive an old man's caution when she learns what we protected." Lena peered at the notebook with intense concentration, her finger tracing words she couldn't, yet read fluently. "What's a safe, Daddy? It's like a treasure box that only opens for the right person. Are we the right people?" Elliot looked at his daughter, bright-eyed, fearless, seeing wonder where adults saw only problems. Then he looked at the submarine, this impossible inheritance that defied logic and explanation. Finally, he looked at Katya, who watched them, both with the patience of someone accustomed to waiting for nature to reveal its secrets. "I think we're about to find out." The marsh wind picked up, carrying the scent of salt and growing things. Somewhere in the distance, a great blue heron called across the water, and deep within the hull of the submarine, something hummed with patient, eternal purpose, waiting for the right combination of courage, curiosity, and desperate need to, finally, unlock its secrets. Elliot folded the notebook carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Tomorrow, he would return with proper equipment and a plan. Tonight, he would read his father's words and try to understand how a man who couldn't stay for his son's childhood had somehow left behind the key to their salvation. "Come on, Lena," he said, taking her hand. "We have work to do." As they walked back through the marsh grass, Lena turned for one last look at their submarine. In her child's imagination, Elliot knew it had already transformed from rusty metal into something magical, a sleeping whale perhaps, or a time machine, or a doorway to adventures beyond anything her 8-year-old mind could fully grasp. What he didn't yet realize was that her imagination might be closer to the truth than his. Adult skepticism could accept. The next morning arrived grey and determined. Elliot had spent the night reading his father's notebook by lamplight, making sense of technical diagrams and cryptic references to the deep cargo and Victor's burden. Sleep had come in fragments, interrupted by dreams of submarine corridors and his father's voice calling from impossible distances. Now, standing before the submarine's access hatch with a crowbar and flashlight, he felt the weight of 40 years pressing against corroded steel. Lena bounced beside him, her backpack stuffed with what she called exploration supplies, crackers, juice boxes, her favorite stuffed elephant, and a collection of colored pencils for documenting their adventure. "The hatch mechanism is designed to be operated from inside," Elliot explained, running his fingers along the ceiling ring. Emergency egress systems were standard on Soviet subs, but this one's been modified. Additional bolting patterns suggested someone had reinforced the closure from within. His father's work, most likely, though the engineering showed a level of sophistication that surprised him. Thomas Granger had been an insurance adjuster, not a marine engineer. Maybe Grandpa Thomas left us another clue, Lena suggested, peering into crevices around the hatch with the thoroughness of youth. She was right. Tucked beneath a protective flap welded to the hull, Elliot found a small metal box containing tools, specialized marine hardware, and a sequence of keys attached to a tag reading, "Victor sends his regards." The first key turned smoothly in a lock that had been maintained despite decades of apparent abandonment. The hatch opened with a pneumatic hiss, releasing air that smelled of machine oil and something else, something floral and unexpected. "Flowers," Lena said, identifying the scent immediately. The submarine's interior defied every assumption Elliot had formed about abandoned vessels. Emergency lighting cast a dim but steady glow through corridors that, while aged, remained structurally sound. The air felt breathable, if stale. Most surprising of all, someone had been caring for this place. They descended through the conning tower into the control room, their footsteps echoing in the metallic silence. Soviet-era equipment lined the walls. Sonar displays, communication panels, navigation instruments frozen in time. But scattered throughout the technical apparatus were touches of human habitation. A coffee cup on the navigation table, reading glasses folded beside a logbook, and fresh flowers in a makeshift vase. "Daddy, look," Lena whispered, pointing to the navigation station. Spread across the chart table were maps that made Elliot's engineering mind race. Not ordinary nautical charts, but detailed surveys of the Atlantic coastline, marked with coordinates and depth soundings. Red lines traced underwater routes from Soviet ports to American waters. Notes in multiple languages, Russian, German, and English, covered the margins, but it was the final destination that made his breath catch. The red line terminated precisely at their current location, marked with a symbol he didn't recognize, and the words, "Final Repository, Operation Poseidon Complete." This submarine didn't get stranded, he realized aloud. It was deliberately positioned here, like a treasure map? Lena asked, studying the charts with fascination. Exactly like a treasure map, they moved deeper into the vessel, following corridors that grew narrower and more specialized. The submarine's layout revealed itself as they explored. Crew quarters, mess hall, engine compartments, and storage areas. Each section told pieces of a story about men who had lived and worked in these confined spaces, carrying out a mission that had ended 40 years ago in a Virginia marsh. In the captain's quarters, they discovered the source of the flowers. A small shrine occupied one corner, photographs of Soviet naval officers, personal effects arranged with ceremonial precision, and fresh roses that couldn't have been placed more than a day ago. "Someone comes here regularly," Elliot observed. "Katya," Lena said with certainty. "She knows about this place." The photographs showed men in naval uniforms, their faces young and serious. One image, larger than the others, depicted an officer whose weathered features and steady gaze suggested command authority. A nameplate identified him as Captain Viktor Petrov, K219. Beneath the photographs lay a leather portfolio containing documents in Russian script. Elliot couldn't read the text, but the official seals and dense paragraphs suggested military orders or operational briefings. More intriguing was a separate folder containing what appeared to be architectural drawings, not of the submarine, but of some kind of specialized safe or vault system. "The safe," he murmured, recognizing elements from his father's notebook. According to the drawings, the safe was integrated into the submarine's hull itself, welded between structural ribs, in the forward compartment. The locking mechanism involved 3 separate systems: mechanical, electronic, and something labeled only as personal verification. They found the location exactly where the drawings indicated. In the forward torpedo room, behind a removable panel that had been disguised to match the surrounding bulkhead, sat a safe unlike anything Elliot had ever seen. The face was a masterpiece of Soviet engineering. Multiple dial combinations, electronic keypads that still glowed despite decades of abandonment, and a final mechanism that appeared to require some form of biological identification. Fingerprints? Lena guessed, examining the scanner. More sophisticated than that. DNA recognition, maybe, or retinal scanning. Elliot studied the device with growing amazement. This technology shouldn't have existed in the 1980s. "Maybe it didn't exist," a voice said from behind them. "Maybe it was invented specifically for this purpose." They turned to find Katya emerging from the shadows of the torpedo room, moving with the quiet confidence of someone familiar with the submarine's layout. She carried a small bouquet of fresh flowers and wore the expression of someone who had been expecting this moment. "You knew we'd come here," Elliot said. "Your father told me you would eventually. He said desperation would drive you where curiosity couldn't. You've been maintaining this place. Victor deserved that much. He died protecting something important." She moved to the small shrine, replacing the previous day's flowers with fresh roses. "The least I could do was ensure his memory remained honored." "Viktor Petrov," Elliot read from the nameplate. "My grandfather." Katya's admission carried the weight of long-held secrets. Captain of the K219. He never made it home from his final mission. The revelation recontextualized everything. Katya's presence in the marsh, her knowledge of the submarine, her connection to his father. This wasn't coincidence, but convergence. Pieces of a 40-year-old puzzle finally coming together through the desperate needs of a broke father and his curious daughter. "What's in the safe?" Elliot asked. "The reason my grandfather died. The reason your father spent his life protecting this place. The reason you and Lena are the only ones who can." "Open it." Lena approached the safe with the fearlessness of childhood, her small fingers tracing the complex locking mechanisms as if trying to understand their purpose through touch. "It's waiting for us," she announced with startling certainty. "It knows. We're here." And indeed, something within the mechanism had activated at their presence. Lights blinked in sequence across the electronic displays. The mechanical dials rotated slightly, as if testing their range of motion. Whatever power source kept the submarine's emergency systems running also maintained this remarkable device. The three locks, Elliot remembered from his father's notes. Physical, electronic, and emotional. "He trained you without your knowledge," Katya explained. "Every story he told you about problem-solving, every technical puzzle he shared during your childhood, he was preparing you for this moment. He abandoned us," Elliot protested. "He wasn't there when I needed him. He was protecting you. If certain people had known about your connection to this place, you and Lena would never have been safe." "What certain people?" "The kind who kill for treasure. The kind who view history as something to be bought and sold, rather than preserved and honored." As if summoned by her words, the submarine's hull resonated with a low metallic sound. Footsteps. On the deck above. Someone else had found their way to the submarine. "Hide!" Katya whispered urgently, but Lena, with the perverse timing of childhood, chose that moment to press her palm against the safe's biological scanner. The device responded immediately, bathing the torpedo room in green light as it analyzed. "Her genetic signature," Match confirmed, announced a synthesized voice in accented English. "Granger family authorization recognized, awaiting additional protocols." The footsteps above stopped abruptly. Then, with deliberate heaviness, they began moving toward the submarine's access points. Elliot pulled Lena close, his mind racing through possibilities. They were trapped in a metal tube with unknown threats approaching, and a safe that had just announced their presence to anyone within hearing range. "How many other people know about this place?" he whispered to Katya. "More than I hoped," she replied grimly. "Fewer than we feared." The first lock had opened, but two remained, and somewhere above them, in the growing darkness of the marsh evening, someone was coming to claim what they believed belonged to them. The footsteps above grew more purposeful, accompanied by the sound of equipment being moved across the submarine's deck. Elliot counted at least 3 distinct sets of boots, suggesting a coordinated search rather than curious locals. "There's another way out," Katya whispered, leading them deeper into the submarine's belly. Victor designed multiple escape routes. They moved through narrow passages that connected the torpedo room to the engine compartments, guided by emergency lighting that seemed to respond to their presence. Behind them, the safe's electronic systems continued their patient humming, waiting for the completion of its unlocking sequence. In the cramped quarters that had once housed the submarine's senior officers, Katya revealed a hidden panel that opened to expose a collection of personal belongings, carefully preserved in waterproof containers. The artifacts told the story of a man who had known his mission would be his last. "Victor's personal effects," she explained, lifting out items that spoke of both military duty and human longing. Soviet naval medals, faded photographs of a young woman and child, letters written in Cyrillic script, and a mechanical watch that still kept perfect time despite 4 decades of abandonment. But it was the final container that made Elliot's breath catch. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth, lay a service pistol and a leather journal bound with cord. The journal's cover bore the same symbol they'd seen on the navigation charts, the mark of Operation Poseidon. He documented everything, Katya continued, opening the journal to reveal pages of meticulous handwriting in multiple languages. The mission parameters, the cargo manifest, the reasons why he chose exile over return. Elliot studied the pages, his limited knowledge of Russian supplemented by technical diagrams that transcended language barriers. The cargo manifest made his engineering mind struggle to comprehend the scope of what they were dealing with. Gold, he read from the English notations. 37 tons of refined gold bars, previously held by the German Reichsbank. Recovered from Alpine repositories in 1945, transferred to Soviet custody under Operation Kaluga. Stolen Nazi gold, Lena said matter-of-factly, as if such things were common knowledge for 8-year-olds. Not stolen, Katya corrected gently. Recovered, liberated from those who had stolen it first. The distinction carried moral weight that Elliot was still processing when the submarine's hull rang like a bell. Someone had found the access hatch and was attempting entry with considerably less finesse than their earlier approach had employed. "Who else knows about this place?" he asked urgently. "Professional treasure hunters mostly, the kind who trade in black market antiquities and don't ask questions about provenance. Your father spent years misleading them, sending them to false locations while protecting the real one. But now they know he's dead, and they know he had a son." The reality of their situation settled over Elliot like cold water. This wasn't just about inheritance or family mysteries anymore. They were sitting inside what amounted to the largest lost treasure in modern history, and people willing to kill for it were literally breaking down the door. Above them, the sounds of forced entry grew louder. Metal tools against metal barriers, followed by the distinctive hiss of cutting equipment. Whoever these people were, they came prepared for serious salvage work. "There's something else," Katya said, her voice heavy with reluctance. "Something Victor's journal reveals about your father." She turned to a section marked with additional care, pages that had been read many times based on the wear patterns. Along the edges, the handwriting here was different, still Russian but in a different hand. "These are your father's additions to Victor's record. He met my grandfather in 1983, during the submarine's final positioning. Thomas wasn't an insurance adjuster, Elliot. He was CIA. The revelation hit like physical force. Everything Elliot thought he knew about his childhood, his father's absences, the family's financial struggles, all of it recontextualized in a single sentence. He was protecting the gold. He was protecting the truth. This gold wasn't just stolen by the Nazis. It was stolen from Jewish families across Europe. Bank deposits, family jewelry, art collections, business assets, everything the Third Reich could seize from those they murdered. Lena listened with the serious attention children reserve for stories they instinctively understand are important, even when the details exceed their experience. "So the treasure belongs to Jewish families?" she asked. "To their descendants?" "Yes. Victor's mission was to prevent it from disappearing into Soviet state coffers. Your father's mission was to ensure it eventually reached its rightful owners. And now it's your choice. You and Lena are the only ones who can complete the unlocking sequence. The question is what you'll do once you succeed." The submarine shuddered as their uninvited guests gained entry to the upper levels. Emergency. Lighting flickered, suggesting damage to the electrical systems that had maintained the vessel's basic functions for decades. "How long before they find us?" Elliot asked. 20 minutes? Maybe 30. They'll search systematically, but they don't know the layout like we do. Enough time to open the safe? If you understand the remaining locks, yes. Elliot studied Victor's journal, looking for clues about the mechanical and emotional components of the locking system. The technical drawings showed a complex mechanism that required specific knowledge to operate safely. More challenging was the emotional component, something that demanded genuine understanding of the treasure's purpose and moral weight. Victor designed it, so only someone with the right motivations could succeed, Katya explained. Someone who understood the difference between taking treasure and returning it to where it belongs. And you think that's us? I think that's why your father chose you. Why he spent years preparing you without telling you what you were being prepared for. Above them, voices called out in English with accents that suggested Eastern European origins. Professional treasure hunters indeed, but not amateurs. The kind of people who understood both the technical challenges of deep salvage work and the political complexities of recovering lost historical artifacts. "Papa," Lena said suddenly, tugging at Elliot's jacket. "Papa, I think the submarine wants to help us." She was pointing to an indicator panel that had begun flashing with new patterns. The emergency systems were responding to the intrusion, activating defensive measures that Victor had built into the vessel's final configuration. "What kind of defensive measures?" Elliot asked Katya. "The kind that protect 37 tons of gold from people who would misuse it," she replied with grim satisfaction. The submarine's pumping systems activated with a low rumble that resonated through the hull. Not damage control, Elliot realized, but a deliberate flooding sequence designed to make certain compartments inaccessible to unauthorized personnel. "Victor thought of everything," Katya continued, "including the possibility that someday the wrong people would find this place. But we're still inside." He also included ways for the right people to override the defensive systems. "If you can prove you deserve access to what he protected." The voices above grew closer, accompanied by the systematic search of compartments. Professional methodology, but also increasing urgency as they realized the submarine systems were actively working against them. Elliot made his decision with the clarity that comes from having no alternatives. "Show us how to open the safe," he told Katya. "All of it. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right. Are you sure?" "Once it's open, there's no hiding what's inside. The knowledge will change everything." He looked at his daughter, who had spent the last hour treating their desperate situation as the greatest adventure of her young life. At Katya, who had devoted years to honoring the memory of a grandfather who chose principle over safety. At Victor's journal, filled with the careful planning of a man who understood that some treasures were too important to be left to chance. "Then it's time for things to change," he said. Katya led them back to the torpedo room, through maintenance passages that bypassed the main corridors, where their uninvited guests were conducting their systematic search. The safe waited exactly as they'd left it, its electronic systems glowing, with patient expectation and one lock already disengaged by Lena's genetic identification. "The second lock requires mechanical knowledge," Katya explained, studying Victor's journal in the dim emergency lighting. "But not just any mechanical knowledge, specifically understanding of Soviet naval engineering principles." She pointed to a series of dials and levers that surrounded the central locking mechanism. Each was marked with Cyrillic characters and positioned according to some internal logic that wasn't immediately apparent. "Your father spent months learning these systems," she continued. "Victor taught him during their final meetings. The settings correspond to the submarine's operational parameters during its last voyage." Elliot examined the mechanism with his engineer's eye, recognizing elements of the pressure systems and ballast controls he'd worked with during his shipbuilding career. Soviet engineering favored redundancy and overspecification, but the underlying principles remained constant across naval architecture. "Draft depth, engine temperature, torpedo tube pressure," he murmured, identifying the variables. "But I need the specific values from the final mission." "Here," Lena said, pointing to a section of Victor's journal she'd been studying while they talked. Her reading skills were still developing, but she'd learned to recognize numbers and patterns with remarkable accuracy. The page showed a detailed log entry from the submarine's last operational day. Navigation coordinates, engine readings, atmospheric data, and most importantly, the precise technical specifications that would serve as the combination for the mechanical lock. Working by feel as much as knowledge, Elliot began adjusting the dials to match Victor's final readings. Each setting clicked into place with satisfying precision, the mechanism responding to inputs that hadn't been attempted in 4 decades. "The craftsmanship is incredible," he admitted, impressed despite their dangerous circumstances. This safe was built to last centuries. Above them, the sounds of search grew more frantic. Their uninvited guests had discovered the flooded compartments and were adapting their approach accordingly. Professional treasure hunters indeed, but also people accustomed to working under pressure and overcoming unexpected obstacles. "How much time do we have?" he asked Katya. "Less than we need," she replied grimly. The mechanical lock disengaged with a deep metallic clunk that resonated through the torpedo room. 2 down, 1 to go. But the third lock presented challenges that transcended technical knowledge. The emotional component. Elliot studied the final mechanism, which appeared to be a complex puzzle box rather than a traditional locking system. What exactly does that mean? Victor believed that access to the treasure should require genuine understanding of its moral weight, Katya explained. Someone motivated by greed would fail. Only someone who truly comprehended the human cost of what was stolen and the importance of returning it could succeed. The puzzle box showed scenes, carved in relief around its circumference, images of families, homes, businesses and communities, representations of the lives that had been destroyed when the Nazi regime seized Jewish assets across occupied Europe. "It's a memorial," Lena observed with the directness of childhood insight. "Like the pictures in the captain's room, but for people we don't know. People whose treasure this was before it was stolen," Elliot agreed, beginning to understand the mechanism's purpose. The puzzle required manipulation of the relief panels in a specific sequence, but the correct order wasn't indicated by any obvious markings. Instead, understanding came from engaging with the story the images told, the progression from normal life through persecution, loss, and ultimately the hope for restoration. "Start with family," Katya suggested. Victor believed that family was the foundation of everything the Nazis tried to destroy. Elliot pressed the panel, showing a family gathered around a dinner table. It depressed slightly, and other panels began to glow with faint internal illumination. "Now loss," Lena said, recognizing the story's progression with the intuitive understanding that made her such an effective puzzle solver. He pressed panels, showing businesses shuttered, homes abandoned, families separated. Each input caused the mechanism to respond with subtle mechanical movements, pieces of an internal system aligning according to the narrative logic Victor had embedded in the design. "And finally, hope," Elliot concluded, pressing the final panel, an image of children playing in a garden, representing the future that could be built when stolen things were returned to their rightful place. The emotional lock disengaged, with a whisper rather than a clunk, as if the mechanism understood the solemnity of what was about to be revealed. Inside the torpedo room, every electronic system fell silent except for the safe itself, which began a final unlocking sequence that would take several minutes to complete. "It's working," Katya breathed, watching decades of careful planning finally come to fruition. But their triumph was interrupted by the sound of boots on metal decking, much closer than before. Their uninvited guests had found the passages leading to the torpedo room and were approaching with the confidence of people who knew their quarry was trapped. "There!" a voice called out in accented English. "The lights! They're in the forward compartment." 3 figures emerged from the shadows of the submarine's corridors, carrying equipment that confirmed their professional status. Underwater cutting tools, salvage gear, and weapons that suggested they were prepared to overcome human obstacles, as well as mechanical ones. The leader, a man whose weathered features and calculating eyes spoke of years in dangerous salvage work, surveyed the scene with immediate understanding. "The safe," he said with satisfaction, "after all these years." "It's not yours," Lena announced with the fearless directness of childhood, stepping protectively in front of the mechanism that was still processing its final unlocking sequence. "Little girl," the man replied with condescending patience, "this treasure belongs to whoever is strong enough to claim it. That's how the world works." "That's how the world worked for the people who stole it in the first place," Katya responded, moving to stand beside Lena. "Ancient history. We're here for present realities." But as he spoke, the safe completed its final sequence. The massive doctor swung open with hydraulic precision, revealing an interior that defied every expectation Elliot had formed. Instead of gold bars stacked like cordwood, the safe contained a sophisticated archival system. Climate-controlled compartments held documents, photographs, and records that told the complete story of Operation Poseidon and its true purpose. "Where's the gold?" the lead treasure hunter demanded. "Safe," Victor's recorded voice answered from speakers built into the mechanism. The message, triggered by the completion of the unlocking sequence, continued in heavily accented but clear English. "Safe, but not here. What you see is the key to finding what was always meant to be returned. The treasure map, you might say." The treasure hunters studied the revealed documents with growing frustration. These were historical records, not negotiable assets, important for understanding the scope of Nazi theft and Soviet recovery, but worthless to people motivated by immediate profit. "The real treasure," Victor's message continued, "requires not just mechanical knowledge, but moral understanding. Not just greed, but justice. Those who have opened this safe have proven they possess what is needed. The coordinates follow." A hidden panel opened, revealing a brass device that looked like a cross between a compass and an astronomical calculator. The cipher wheel that would decode the final location of the 37 tons of gold that had been Victor's true legacy. But first, they would have to get past 3 armed treasure hunters who had just realized they'd been outmaneuvered by a dead Soviet submarine captain and were not pleased about it. The brass cipher wheel felt warm in Elliot's hands, as if it had been waiting decades for this moment. Its surface was covered with concentric rings of symbols, Cyrillic letters, nautical coordinates, and mathematical notations that spoke to the sophisticated mind that had designed this final puzzle. "Nobody moves," the lead treasure hunter commanded, his weapon now clearly visible. "We've come too far to be stopped by riddles and sentiment." But even as he spoke, the submarine's emergency systems responded to the completion of the safe's unlocking sequence. Lights dimmed and shifted to a red emergency configuration. Throughout the hull, mechanical systems began activating in patterns that suggested Victor had anticipated exactly this scenario. He planned for this, Katya realized, allowed even the possibility that the wrong people would be present when the safe opened. The submarine's defensive systems weren't just flooding compartments anymore. They were actively reconfiguring the vessel's internal layout. Blast doors sealed off escape routes, while others opened passages that hadn't been accessible before. The treasure hunters found themselves trapped in a space that was rapidly becoming a carefully engineered maze. "What the hell is this?" one of them demanded, trying to backtrack toward the way they'd entered, only to find the passage blocked by a security barrier that hadn't been there minutes earlier. "Soviet engineering," Elliot replied, studying the cipher wheel while keeping one eye on their increasingly agitated captors. "They built redundancy into everything, including the possibility that unauthorized personnel might compromise the operation." The captain's log that Katya had preserved contained more than just operational records. It included Victor's complete tactical assessment of how to protect the treasure from various threat scenarios. Professional treasure hunters who overcame. The submarine's passive defenses would trigger active countermeasures designed to contain them until proper authorities could respond. "There are no proper authorities," the leader snarled. "This treasure has been lost for 40 years. Finders, keepers, Tell that to the families whose bank accounts were emptied to fill Nazi coffers, Lena said with startling directness. Tell that to the people who had their houses and businesses stolen. The 8-year-old's moral clarity seemed to unnerve the treasure hunters more than Katya's adult arguments had. Children, Elliot realized, had a way of cutting through rationalizations that adults used to justify questionable actions. While their captors argued among themselves about how to overcome Victor's defensive systems, Elliot studied the cipher, wheel with growing understanding. The device wasn't just a coordinate calculator, it was a comprehensive archival tool that told the complete story of Operation Poseidon. Each ring of symbols corresponded to different aspects of the mission. Historical dates, geographical locations, personnel involved, and most importantly, the moral reasoning that had guided every decision. Victor hadn't just hidden treasure. He'd created a complete historical record that would allow future generations to understand why the mission had been necessary. The gold isn't the real treasure, he murmured, beginning to grasp Victor's deeper purpose. What? Katya leaned closer, keeping her voice low enough that their captors couldn't overhear. Look at this documentation. Comprehensive records of Nazi theft, Soviet recovery operations, family histories, legal frameworks for restoration. Victor didn't just save the gold, he preserved the knowledge needed to return it properly. To whom? Lena asked, studying the cipher wheel with fascination. To a foundation that's been waiting 40 years for this information, Elliot read from newly revealed text that appeared as he manipulated the device's settings. The International Committee for Holocaust Asset Recovery, established 1983, funded by anonymous donors, dedicated to identifying and returning stolen property to surviving families. Your father, Katya breathed. He helped establish the foundation. The revelation recontextualized Thomas Granger's entire adult life. Not an absent father pursuing mysterious work, but a man carrying the weight of ensuring that one of history's greatest thefts would eventually be made right. His absence from family life had been the price of protecting something larger than personal happiness. I still don't forgive him, Elliot said quietly, though his anger now carried undertones of understanding he'd never felt before. He didn't expect forgiveness. He hoped for understanding, eventually. The submarine's defensive systems had completed their reconfiguration, trapping the treasure hunters in a section of the vessel that offered no escape routes, but also no immediate danger. Victor's engineering had been designed to contain rather than harm, a distinction that spoke to the moral considerations that had guided the entire operation. You can't keep us here forever, the lead treasure hunter called out, though his voice now carried uncertainty rather than command authority. We don't need forever, Elliot replied, working the cipher wheel through a sequence that revealed the final piece of Victor's puzzle. Just long enough for the right people to arrive, because that's what the cipher wheel's final message revealed. Not just coordinates for the gold's location, but activation codes for a communication system that would alert the International Committee that Operation Poseidon had finally reached its conclusion. The Foundation has been monitoring this location for decades, he continued, reading from the device's display. Automated systems, satellite surveillance, emergency response protocols. The moment this safe opened, they knew. As if summoned by his words, the submarine's communication systems crackled to life with incoming transmissions. Official voices speaking with the authority of people who had been waiting years for this exact moment. K219, this is Recovery Team Alpha. We are inbound to your location with full legal authority for historical asset recovery. Please acknowledge. Katya moved to the submarine's communication console, which had somehow remained functional despite decades of abandonment. Recovery Team Alpha, this is Dr. Katya Vulkov. The Operation Poseidon archive has been successfully opened. We have the complete documentation package and are ready for secure transfer. Acknowledge, Dr. Vulkov. Your grandfather would be proud. The words carried weight beyond professional courtesy. These people had known Victor, had worked with the network he'd helped establish, had spent decades preparing for the moment when his sacrifice would finally bear fruit. "How did they know about Katya?" Elliot asked. "Because she's been their liaison all along," she admitted. "My botanical research was real, but it was also cover for maintaining the security of this site. The committee needed someone on location who could respond when the time came. And you knew my father. I knew his role in the operation. I knew he was preparing you and Lena for eventual participation, though I didn't know what form that would take." Above them, the sounds of helicopter rotors indicated that the recovery team had arrived with equipment adequate for the technical challenges of extracting both people and archives from a submarine embedded in marsh terrain. The treasure hunters, realizing that their window of opportunity was rapidly closing, made one final desperate attempt to claim something of value from their failed expedition. But Victor's defensive systems had been designed by someone who understood the difference between justice and greed. The compartment that contained the real gold, 37 tons of refined bars bearing the marks of their theft and recovery, remained, sealed behind barriers that would only open for people carrying proper authorization from the International Committee. The cipher wheel provided the coordinates, but not the access codes. The gold stays protected until the committee's legal team can establish proper chain of custody, Elliot read from the final section of Victor's documentation. No individual, regardless of their role in the recovery, can claim ownership. The treasure belongs to the families from whom it was stolen, and to them it will be returned. "What about us?" Lena asked. "Do we get a reward?" "We get something. Better than a reward," he replied, looking at his daughter with new understanding of what his father had tried to teach him about values that transcended monetary considerations. "We get to be part of making something right." Outside the submarine, the recovery team was establishing a secure perimeter and beginning the complex process of extracting 4 decades of carefully preserved historical evidence. Inside, 3 frustrated treasure hunters contemplated the reality that their biggest heist had become their greatest failure. And in the torpedo room of a Soviet submarine that had found its final purpose in a Virginia marsh, a father, his daughter, and the granddaughter of a heroic captain prepared to complete a mission that had begun before any of them were born. The recovery team's arrival transformed the submarine from a hidden archaeological site into a bustling center of historical preservation activity. Professional archivists, legal experts, and security personnel worked with military efficiency to catalog and protect 4 decades of carefully maintained evidence. Dr. Sarah Chen, the committee's lead archaeologist, examined Victor's archives with the reverence due to artifacts that had shaped modern history. Each document, photograph, and personal effect was photographed, catalogued, and prepared for transfer to climate-controlled facilities where scholars could spend years unraveling the complete story of Nazi theft and Soviet recovery. "This is unprecedented," she explained to Elliot as they watched her team work. "Most Holocaust asset recovery involves fragments, partial records, scattered evidence, incomplete documentation. What Captain Petrov preserved is a complete operational archive. Family histories, theft documentation, recovery records, even personal effects that can be matched to specific victims. The Operation Poseidon files revealed the staggering scope of systematic theft that had funded the Nazi war machine. Bank accounts emptied overnight, businesses seized without compensation, family treasures confiscated under the pretext of national security. But more importantly, the files contained the painstaking research that Soviet investigators had conducted to identify the original owners. Your father spent 20 years updating these records, Dr. Chen continued, showing Elliot pages of careful additions to Victor's original documentation. Birth certificates, immigration records, survivor testimony, family genealogies. He treated this as sacred work. Lena studied the photographs of families whose possessions filled the archive, children her own age, grandparents who reminded her of people she knew, ordinary people whose extraordinary losses had been carefully documented by men who understood the importance of remembering. "Will they get their things back?" she asked Dr. Chen. "Some will. Many of the families died in the Holocaust, but survivors exist, as do their descendants. The gold will fund efforts to locate them and provide compensation where direct return isn't possible. What about the people who tried to steal it today?" Dr. Chen glanced toward the section of Submarine where the treasure hunters remained under guard, awaiting transfer to federal authorities. "They'll face charges for attempted theft of historical artifacts and trespassing on a protected site, but mainly they'll have learned that some things are worth more than their market value." The cipher wheel continued to reveal new layers of information as the recovery team's specialists worked with its mechanisms. Beyond the gold's coordinates, it contained legal frameworks for restoration, contact information for survivor organizations, and detailed protocols for ensuring that recovered assets reached their intended recipients rather than government treasuries or private collectors. "Victor thought of everything," Katya observed, watching the systematic revelation of her grandfather's life work. "Even the possibility that the knowledge might be misused. He learned from history," Dr. Chen agreed. "Too many recovery efforts have enriched institutions while ignoring individual victims. This operation was designed to bypass those systems entirely. But as the day progressed, complications arose that even Victor's careful planning hadn't fully anticipated. The custody hearing that had been weighing on Elliot's mind was scheduled for the following week, and Sarah's legal team had discovered that his involvement in the submarine discovery could complicate his case. "The problem isn't your actions," explained James Morrison, the committee's legal counsel. "It's the perception that you might have access to significant financial resources. Custody courts consider a parent's economic stability as a major factor in placement decisions. But I don't have access to the gold," Elliot protested. "It belongs to Holocaust survivors." Try explaining that to a family court judge who sees news reports about a man who inherited a submarine full of treasure. The truth is complex. Media coverage rarely is. Indeed, word of the discovery had already begun to leak beyond the immediate recovery team. Helicopter overflights, official vehicles, and coordinated activity in a previously ignored corner of the Virginia marshes had attracted attention from local media outlets who were beginning to piece together fragments of a story that would inevitably become sensationalized. "Daddy," Lena said, tugging on his sleeve with the urgency that indicated important 8-year-old insights. "What if we don't tell people about the treasure part?" "What do you mean?" "What if we tell them about the memorial part? About helping families find things that belong to their grandparents?" Her suggestion carried the kind of clarity that adults often missed while overcomplicating situations. The story wasn't about treasure discovery. It was about historical justice, not about personal enrichment, but about correcting old wrongs. "That's brilliant," Morrison agreed. "The committee has significant experience with media management for sensitive historical discoveries. We can control the narrative to emphasize the humanitarian aspects of the operation." "Will that help with the custody hearing?" Elliot asked. "It should. Participation in historically significant humanitarian work demonstrates stability, moral character, and the kind of values courts want to see in primary custodial parents." As evening approached, the recovery team completed their initial assessment and began preparations for the complex process of extracting the submarine's archives. The vessel itself would remain in place, too large to move and too significant to destroy, but would be converted into a memorial site where visitors could learn about Operation Poseidon and the broader history of Holocaust asset recovery. "The submarine will become part of the permanent historical record," Dr. Chen explained. A place where people can come to understand how individual actions can contribute to historical justice, even across decades. What about us? Lena asked. Do we get to come back and visit? You'll always be welcome here, Katya assured her. This place exists because of your curiosity, your courage, and your grandfather's legacy. You're part of its story now. But even as they celebrated the successful completion of Victor's 40-year mission, Elliot felt the weight of unresolved questions about his father's choices and their impact on his own life. Understanding Thomas Granger's motivations didn't automatically heal the wounds left by his absence during crucial childhood moments. He could have found a way to be present for both missions, he said to Katya as they watched the recovery team's methodical work. Other people managed to balance family responsibility with important work. Perhaps the stakes were too high for anything less than complete dedication. We'll never know what threats he was protecting you from by maintaining distance. I needed a father, not a protector. And Lena needs a father now. One who understands the difference between treasure and what really matters. The observation carried weight that extended beyond their current circumstances. The submarine discovery had solved Elliot's immediate financial problems. The committee would provide compensation for his role in the operation, enough to stabilize his situation and strengthen his custody case. But more importantly, it had provided him with a deeper understanding of what kind of legacy he wanted to leave for his daughter. As the day concluded and the recovery team secured the site for continued work the following morning, Elliot made a decision that would have made his father proud, even if they'd never had the chance to discuss it directly. I want to be involved in the ongoing work, he told Dr. Chen, not for money, but because this is important. Because Lena should grow up understanding that some things matter more than personal advantage. The committee always needs people with engineering expertise and moral commitment, she replied. Especially people who understand that historical justice requires both technical skill and personal dedication. Standing in the torpedo room, where Victor's safe had finally yielded its secrets, surrounded by evidence of careful planning and moral courage that had spanned decades, Elliot felt the presence of connections that transcended individual lifespans. His father, Victor, Katya's family, the countless victims whose stories were preserved in the archives, all connected by the understanding that some responsibilities transcend personal convenience. The treasure hunt had ended. The real work was just beginning. 3 weeks later, as Elliot prepared for his custody hearing with newfound confidence, Dr. Chen called with news that changed everything they thought they understood about Operation Poseidon. We found something, she said, her voice carrying the careful neutrality of a professional dealing with explosive discoveries. Something that wasn't in Victor's original documentation. She arrived at Elliot's apartment that evening, carrying a briefcase that might as well have contained dynamite. Inside lay documents that had been hidden within a false bottom of Victor's personal effects box. Material so sensitive that even the submarine's comprehensive archives hadn't included them. The dossier of betrayal, as Chen had labeled it, revealed that Thomas Granger hadn't simply been a CIA operative protecting Holocaust assets. He'd been a double agent, working simultaneously for American intelligence and a secret network of Holocaust survivors who had decided that official recovery efforts weren't moving fast enough. Your father was part of an organization called the Descendants, Chen explained, as Lena colored quietly at the kitchen table, within earshot, but ostensibly focused on her art project. Families of Holocaust victims who took direct action to recover stolen assets when legal channels failed. The documents painted a picture of systematic cooperation between Soviet naval intelligence and Holocaust survivor networks that had operated entirely outside official diplomatic channels. Victor's submarine hadn't just been carrying recovered Nazi gold, it had been transporting the foundation assets for a parallel recovery system that had been helping families reclaim stolen property for decades. The International Committee for Holocaust Asset Recovery, Chen continued, wasn't established by governments or international organizations. It was founded and funded by people who had lost everything and decided to take responsibility for getting it back. People like Katya's family, Elliot realized. Exactly. Victor's granddaughter wasn't just a botanist maintaining a memorial site. She was an operational controller for the descendants, ensuring that the submarine remained secure until the right moment for final activation. The revelation recontextualized every interaction they'd had with Katya since discovering the submarine. Her presence at the marsh, her knowledge of his father, her careful guidance through the safe's unlocking sequence, all part of a carefully orchestrated plan that had been decades in the making. "She's been watching us," Lena observed without looking up from her coloring. "Since before we came to the submarine, I saw her at my school once, and at the grocery store. Children," Elliot reflected, "notice things that adults missed while focusing on larger concerns." "Protective surveillance," Chen confirmed. "Your father requested it as part of his operational security. The descendants couldn't risk anything happening to you or Lena before you could fulfill your role in the operation." "What role?" Elliot demanded, feeling manipulated by forces he hadn't known existed. "We were just desperate people investigating a strange inheritance." "You were the activation key," Chen replied gently. "The genetic identification system, the mechanical knowledge requirements, the emotional intelligence needed to understand the safe's moral locks, all calibrated specifically for Thomas Granger's son and granddaughter. The documents included psychological profiles, genetic analyses, and educational assessments that showed the degree of planning that had shaped Elliot's entire life. His career in marine engineering, his moral development, even his relationship with Lena had been monitored and subtly influenced to ensure he would be capable of completing Operation Poseidon when the time came. "Everything was manipulated," he said, the words carrying decades of suppressed anger about his father's absence, and the growing realization that even his adult choices hadn't been entirely his own. "Not manipulated," Chen corrected. "Prepared. There's a difference between forcing someone to become something they're not and creating opportunities for them to become what they're capable of being." "Is there? Your father could have programmed the safe to accept any genetic signature, any combination of mechanical knowledge. Instead, he chose to make it specific to his family because he believed you and Lena possessed qualities that couldn't be replicated through training alone." "What qualities?" "Moral courage under pressure, the ability to see beyond immediate self-interest to larger principles, the kind of character that chooses justice over convenience." Lena had stopped coloring and was listening with the intense focus she reserved for adult conversations that might affect her directly. "So we're like superheroes?" she asked. "You're like people who do the right thing when it matters most," Chen replied, "which is rarer and more important than having superpowers." But the documents contained one final revelation that explained why Thomas Granger had made the most painful sacrifice of all, complete separation from his family during Elliot's childhood and adolescence. "The descendants had been infiltrated," Chen explained, showing surveillance reports and threat assessments that documented systematic attempts to compromise their operations. "Your father's role had been discovered by organizations that profit from keeping Holocaust assets in private collections rather than returning them to survivors. So he disappeared to protect us. He disappeared because staying would have made you and your mother targets. The people who tried to claim the submarine's treasure 3 weeks ago weren't amateur treasure hunters. They were representatives of an international network that has been hunting the descendants for decades." The reality hit like physical force. Every birthday his father had missed, every school event where Elliot had looked for him in the crowd, every moment of wondering why he wasn't important enough to merit his father's presence, all necessary sacrifices to keep him and his mother safe from people who would have used them as leverage against Operation Poseidon. The custody battle, Elliot realized with growing horror, was initiated by people who wanted to separate you from Lena. A single father struggling with custody issues is vulnerable. A single father with a support network and legal resources is harder to manipulate. Sarah's new husband, the lawyer with the steady income and predictable weekends, had been feeding information about Elliot's situation to parties interested in disrupting his access to Lena before the submarine's location could be revealed. "They've been planning this for years," Chen continued, "waiting for Thomas Granger to die so they could move against his family before you could complete the operation he'd spent decades preparing you for." "What do we do now?" Lena asked, with the practical directness that had made her such an effective partner in opening Victor's safe. "Now we make sure the people responsible for 40 years of manipulation face the consequences of their actions," Chen replied. "And we ensure that you and your father can build the kind of life together that your grandfather wished he could have given you." The dossier included evidence of financial manipulation, custody case interference, and even the deliberate sabotage of Elliot's employment that had led to his desperate financial situation. Every hardship that had driven him to investigate his father's strange inheritance had been orchestrated by people who wanted to control the timing and circumstances of Operation Poseidon's conclusion. The treasure hunters who tried to claim the submarine weren't working independently, Chen explained. They were advanced scouts for a much larger organization that has been systematically looting Holocaust recovery efforts for private profit. But we stopped them. We stopped that particular attempt. The larger network is still active, still dangerous, and still interested in preventing the descendants from completing their work. Outside Elliot's apartment, the evening seemed normal. Traffic, sounds, neighbor conversations, the ordinary rhythms of suburban life. Inside, 3 people contemplated the reality that they were part of a secret war that had been fought in shadows for generations, involving stakes that transcended personal concerns about custody hearings and financial stability. "So what happens next?" Elliot asked. "Next, we use the evidence your father preserved to expose the network that has been profiting from Holocaust victims for decades. We ensure that Victor's sacrifice and your father's sacrifice and your family's sacrifice finally accomplishes what it was intended to accomplish. Justice," Lena said, testing the word like she was trying on a new piece of clothing. "Justice," Chen agreed. "The kind that takes generations to achieve, but changes the world when it finally happens." The plot twist had revealed that their treasure hunt hadn't been about finding gold at all. It had been about becoming the kind of people capable of ensuring that stolen things were returned to where they belonged, regardless of personal cost or convenience. Now, the real challenge would begin. The master key wasn't a physical object. It was understanding. As Elliot studied the complete Operation Poseidon archives in the days leading up to the custody hearing, he began to grasp the elegant complexity of what his father and Victor had created over 4 decades of careful planning. "It's not just about the gold," he explained to Katya as they sat in the submarine's converted command center, now serving as a temporary research facility for the committee's ongoing work. "It's about creating a system that can continue operating even after everyone who started it is gone." The master key was the realization that the descendants hadn't just been recovering stolen Holocaust assets. They'd been building a self-sustaining network capable of fighting institutional theft across generations. The submarine, the archives, the careful preparation of genetic heirs, even the orchestrated crisis that had brought Elliot to the marsh, all components of a machine designed to outlast its creators. Victor understood that evil is patient, Katya agreed, watching Lena explore the submarine's nooks and crannies with the confident familiarity of someone who had claimed the vessel as her personal adventure playground. He knew that the people who profit from stolen history would wait decades for opportunities to complete their theft. So he built something that could wait longer. The archives revealed the full scope of what they were fighting. Not just individual treasure hunters or even organized criminal networks, but an international system of museums, private collectors, auction houses, and financial institutions that had built entire business models around trafficking in stolen Holocaust assets. They don't see themselves as criminals, Dr. Chen had explained during her briefings. They see themselves as preserving history by keeping artifacts in prestigious collections rather than returning them to families they consider unworthy of ownership. The distinction mattered because it explained the sophistication of their operations. These weren't crude thieves breaking into museums. They were educated professionals who used legal loopholes, jurisdictional complexities, and bureaucratic delays to legitimize theft through institutional processes. That's why your father's approach was so threatening to them, Chen continued. The descendants bypass traditional recovery channels entirely. They don't ask permission from courts or negotiate with museums. They simply take back what was stolen and return it directly to the families it came from. The custody hearing had been transformed by the committee's legal intervention from a simple domestic dispute into a test case for the entire descendants operation. If Sarah's lawyers, backed by parties with interests in preventing Elliot from continuing his father's work, could successfully separate him from Lena, they would break the genetic chain that Victor had so carefully constructed for accessing. The submarine's deeper secrets. There are other safes, Chen had revealed. Other submarines, other archives, other treasures hidden across the world. The Operation Poseidon network extends far beyond what we found in Virginia, but they're all heed to specific genetic signatures, specific knowledge sets, specific moral frameworks. Without the proper keys, they remain permanently sealed, and Lena is one of those keys. Lena represents the future of the operation, the next generation, raised from childhood to understand the moral weight of historical justice rather than learning it as adults under crisis conditions. The realization carried both pride and terror. Elliot was proud that his daughter possessed qualities that decades of careful genetic and educational planning had tried to cultivate. But he was terrified of the responsibility that such heritage implied for her future. She gets to choose, Katya reminded him during one of their late-night planning sessions. When she's old enough to understand the full implications, she can decide whether to continue the work or pursue a completely normal life. The key is ensuring she has that choice, which means winning the custody hearing, which means exposing the forces that have been manipulating your family for years. The committee's legal team had prepared a presentation that would reveal the true nature of the custody challenge. Not a concerned mother seeking stability for her child, but a coordinated attempt by international theft networks to gain control over assets they'd been hunting for decades. We have documentation of financial transfers from private collection interests to Sarah's legal team, Morrison explained. Communication intercepts showing coordination between her attorney and parties with clear interests in disrupting descendants' operations. Even evidence that her new husband's law firm specializes in facilitating the transfer of disputed cultural artifacts to private collectors. She might not even know, Elliot said, struggling with the possibility that his ex-wife had become an unwitting tool of forces she didn't understand. She might not, but ignorance doesn't change the impact of her actions on Lena's safety and your ability to continue vital humanitarian work. The evidence was overwhelming, but presenting it would require revealing the existence of the descendants, network, and potentially compromising other operations worldwide. The committee had decided the risk was worth it. Operation Poseidon had always been designed as a disclosure operation, intended to bring the shadow war over Holocaust assets into public view when the time was right. Your father knew this moment would come, Chen assured him. He prepared for the possibility that completing the operation would require sacrificing its secrecy. Some things are more important than operational security. Like what? Like ensuring that future generations understand the difference between justice and theft. Like making sure that Lena grows up in a world where stolen things are returned, rather than celebrated as acquisitions. As the hearing date approached, Elliot found himself spending increasing amounts of time in the submarine, trying to understand his father through the environment that had shaped the final decades of Thomas Granger's life. The vessel had become a shrine to patient determination. Every system maintained, every archive preserved, every contingency planned for across 40 years of dedicated preparation. He lived for this place, Elliot realized one evening as he studied technical drawings that showed modifications Thomas had made to Victor's original systems. Not the submarine itself, but what it represented. "Hope!" Lena said, joining him in the torpedo room where Victor's safe now stood permanently open, its contents catalogued but its symbolic importance undiminished. "Hope that stolen things could be given back." "How do you know that?" "Because that's what the submarine feels like hope that waited a really long time." Her 8-year-old insight cut through complexities that adult analysis sometimes missed. The submarine did feel hopeful, not in the naive sense of expecting easy solutions, but in the mature sense of maintaining purpose despite obstacles. "Are you ready for tomorrow?" he asked her. "Are you?" The question carried more weight than most adult conversations. Tomorrow's hearing would determine not just their family's future, but the fate of a humanitarian operation that had been built across decades of sacrifice and planning. If they succeeded, Lena would grow up understanding that some responsibilities transcend personal convenience. If they failed, she would learn that powerful interests could separate families when larger principles were at stake. "I think I'm ready," he said. "I think Grandpa Thomas prepared us better than we knew, even though he wasn't there for birthdays and stuff. Especially because he wasn't there for birthdays and stuff. He was busy making sure we'd be ready for something more important than birthday parties." As they prepared to leave the submarine for what might be their final visit as private individuals rather than public symbols of historical justice, Elliot felt the presence of connections that extended across generations. Victor, dying far from home to protect treasure that belonged to murdered families. Thomas, sacrificing personal happiness to build systems that could outlast individual lifespans. Katya, dedicating her life to honoring both men's sacrifices. And now Lena, poised to inherit not just genetic codes and technical knowledge, but the moral framework that could guide humanity's relationship with its own history. "Tomorrow, we find out if we're strong enough to be the people they needed us to become," he told his daughter, as they sealed the submarine's access hatch for the night. "We already are," she replied, with the confidence that had helped her solve Victor's puzzles and unlock safes that had defeated professional treasure hunters. "We just need to prove it to other people." The master key, Elliot realized, wasn't something they needed to find. It was something they had become through the process of understanding what their inheritance truly meant. Now they would discover whether a family court judge could recognize the difference between treasure and justice, between custody and responsibility, between protecting a child and protecting the future. The family court hearing began like any other custody proceeding. 2 parents, their attorneys, and a judge trying to determine what arrangement would best serve a child's interests. But within the first hour, it became clear that this case would redefine how legal systems understood the intersection of family law and international justice. Sarah's attorney presented the expected arguments. Elliot's recent unemployment, his involvement in dangerous treasure hunting activities, his association with questionable international organizations. Standard tactics for undermining a father's custody claim, delivered with professional competence that suggested genuine belief in their validity. "Your Honor," the attorney concluded, "Mr. Granger's recent activities demonstrate a pattern of risk-taking behavior that places our client's daughter in potentially dangerous situations. We believe Lena's safety and stability would be better served in a more conventional family environment. Judge Patricia Williams had heard similar arguments hundreds of times during 20 years on the family court bench. Middle-aged parents fighting over children, while lawyers argued about financial stability and moral fitness. But when Morrison rose to present Elliot's defense, she realized this case would challenge every assumption she'd formed about custody disputes. Your Honor, we're going to present evidence that this custody challenge represents something unprecedented in American family law, an attempt by international criminal networks to separate a child from her father in order to disrupt humanitarian operations that threaten their illegal profits. The courtroom fell silent. Sarah looked confused. Her attorney appeared genuinely surprised. Even Elliot felt a moment of vertigo as the committee's legal strategy moved from preparation to execution. Morrison's presentation began with historical documentation, Holocaust asset theft, Soviet recovery operations, the systematic failure of official restitution efforts to return stolen property to surviving families, standard historical testimony that established the context for what would follow. Then he introduced the gold bars themselves, physical evidence wheeled into the courtroom on a secure cart, each bar marked with Nazi Reich Eagle stamps and Soviet recovery documentation. 37 tons of refined gold that told a story spanning 3 generations of theft, recovery, and protection. These artifacts represent the largest cache of recovered Holocaust assets ever discovered, Morrison explained to Judge Williams, who was studying the bars with the fascination of someone confronting tangible history. They were preserved by a Soviet submarine captain who chose exile over returning them to state coffers, protected by a CIA operative who sacrificed his family relationships to ensure their eventual return to survivors, and finally recovered by Mr. Granger and his daughter through genetic identification systems, specifically designed to prevent unauthorized access. And Ms. Patterson's custody challenge, the judge asked, referring to Sarah by her married name, was initiated and funded by parties with clear financial interests in gaining control over these assets and disrupting the recovery network that has been returning stolen Holocaust property to survivors for decades. The evidence presentation that followed resembled a criminal conspiracy trial more than a family court proceeding. Financial records showing payments from private collection interests to Sarah's legal team. Communication intercepts revealing coordination between her attorney and parties known to traffic in stolen cultural artifacts. Documentary proof that her new husband's law firm specialized in legitimizing transfers of disputed historical objects to private collectors. Your Honor, Morrison continued, Ms. Patterson may be unaware of how she's being used, but the effect of her legal action is clear. Separating Mr. Granger from his daughter would break a genetic chain that protects historical assets worth hundreds of millions of dollars from theft by international criminal networks. Sarah's face showed genuine shock as the implications became clear. Whatever motivations had driven her custody challenge, they hadn't included participation in international conspiracy. I didn't know, she whispered to her attorney, loud enough for the court to hear. But her attorney's reaction suggested more complicated knowledge. His objections to Morrison's evidence presentation focused on technicalities rather than substance, and his arguments emphasized procedural concerns rather than addressing the criminal implications of his client's funding sources. Judge Williams called a recess to review the committee's documentation in her chambers. The evidence was overwhelming, but the legal precedents were unclear. How should family courts handle custody disputes that involved international humanitarian operations? What weight should be given to a child's role in protecting historical artifacts from theft? During the break, Dr. Chen testified via video conference about Lena's remarkable abilities and the importance of her continued involvement in recovery operations. She possesses an intuitive understanding of complex puzzle systems that we've never seen in someone her age, Chen explained. But more importantly, she demonstrates the moral reasoning necessary to distinguish between treasure hunting and historical justice. These qualities can't be replicated through training. They emerge from genetic predisposition combined with proper moral education. And if she's separated from her father, the recovery network loses access to assets that could help thousands of Holocaust survivor families. But more importantly, Lena loses the opportunity to grow up understanding that some responsibilities transcend personal convenience. When the hearing resumed, Judge Williams faced a decision that would establish precedents for cases involving children whose inheritance included humanitarian responsibilities spanning generations. This court has reviewed evidence suggesting that Ms. Patterson's custody challenge was initiated and funded by parties with criminal interests in disrupting international Holocaust asset recovery operations, she announced. While Ms. Patterson herself appears to be unaware of these connections, the effect of granting her petition would be to separate a child from humanitarian work of extraordinary historical importance. Sarah's attorney made a final attempt to reframe the case in conventional custody terms, but his arguments now carried the hollow ring of legal technicalities divorced from moral considerations. Your Honor, regardless of these alleged international conspiracies, our primary concern remains Lena's safety and stability. Involving a child in treasure hunting activities, regardless of their humanitarian purpose, exposes her to unnecessary risks. And yet, Judge Williams replied, the evidence suggests that separating her from these activities would expose her to far greater risks from parties willing to use violence to gain control over recovered Holocaust assets. The first phase of the climax had established the stakes and revealed the true nature of the conflict. But the resolution would require more than legal arguments. It would require wisdom that transcended jurisdictional boundaries and acknowledged that some children inherit responsibilities that make conventional custody arrangements impossible. The gold bars sat in their display case, silent witnesses to decades of theft, recovery, and protection. Soon, the court would decide whether they would continue to serve the families from whom they had been stolen or become trophies for collectors, who viewed history as something to be owned rather than honored. Judge Williams requested that Lena be brought to her chambers for a private conversation. Standard procedure in custody cases involving children old enough to express preferences about their living arrangements. But this interview would determine not just family placement, but the future of a humanitarian operation that had been built across decades of sacrifice. "Hello, Lena," Judge Williams said gently, as the 8-year-old settled into a chair that seemed too large for her small frame. "Do you understand why we're all here today? Because some people want to stop me and Daddy from helping families get their things back," Lena replied, with the directness that had made her such an effective partner in solving Victor's puzzles. "And how do you feel about that?" "I think it's mean. If someone stole your grandmother's jewelry, wouldn't you want it back?" The question carried weight beyond its simple phrasing. Judge Williams had indeed inherited jewelry from her grandmother, pieces that connected her to family history and cultural identity. The thought of those items in a private collection, admired by strangers who had purchased them from thieves, was genuinely disturbing. What if returning these things to families means you can't have a normal childhood? The judge asked. What if it means traveling to dangerous places and solving complicated puzzles instead of playing with friends and going to regular school? What's normal? Lena asked in return. Is normal leaving treasure in a submarine because you're scared to open safes? Or is normal helping people get back things that belonged to their grandparents? Judge Williams found herself confronting questions that transcended family law. How should society balance a child's right to conventional childhood against their Potential contribution to historical justice. When did protective instincts become obstacles to moral development? Do you want to live with your mother? She asked directly. I want to live where I can help people, Lena replied. Mommy's nice, but she doesn't understand about submarines and safes and families who lost everything. Daddy understands. He's learning to understand like Grandpa Thomas did. What if your mother learned to understand too? She could, but her new husband doesn't want her to. He wants the treasure to go to museums where rich people can look at it instead of back to the families it belongs to. The child's insight into adult motivations was startling. Somewhere during the past month, Lena had developed an understanding of ethical complexities that many adults never achieved. Are you afraid of the people who want to stop you and your father? Sometimes. But being afraid doesn't mean you don't do the right thing. It means you do the right thing even when it's scary. Judge Williams had presided over thousands of custody cases, but she'd never encountered a child who spoke with such clarity about moral responsibility. The conventional wisdom of family law suggested that children should be protected from adult complexities, allowed to develop gradually through normal social experiences. But what happened when a child possessed abilities that could serve historical justice in ways that normal development couldn't replicate? The memorial list that Morrison had introduced as evidence contained over 3,000 names, Holocaust victims whose families had been identified through Victor's research as rightful beneficiaries of recovered assets. Each name represented parents, children, siblings, grandparents whose possessions had been systematically stolen by people who viewed human beings as sources of profit. Do you understand how many people you might be able to help? Judge Williams asked, showing Lena the memorial list. All of them, Lena said simply, studying the pages with serious attention. Every single family that lost things should get them back. That's what fair means. When they returned to the courtroom, Judge Williams faced a decision that would establish precedents for cases involving children whose inheritance transcended conventional family wealth. The evidence was clear. Sarah's custody challenge was funded by parties with criminal interests in disrupting Holocaust asset recovery. But the broader question remained: how should family courts handle children whose unique abilities served humanitarian purposes that conventional parenting couldn't accommodate? This court finds that Lena Granger possesses extraordinary abilities that enable her to contribute to historically significant humanitarian work, Judge Williams announced. These abilities appear to result from careful genetic selection and moral education spanning multiple generations, designed specifically to ensure that recovered Holocaust assets reach their intended beneficiaries rather than being diverted to private collections or state treasuries. Sarah listened with growing understanding of how she'd been manipulated. Her attorney's funding sources, her new husband's professional interests, even her own legitimate concerns about Lena's safety, all exploited by parties who viewed her daughter as an obstacle to profitable theft. However, the judge continued, this court also recognizes that Ms. Patterson was unaware of the criminal interests supporting her legal action. Her concern for her daughter's welfare appears genuine, even if her information about the family's circumstances was incomplete. The solution Judge Williams proposed was unprecedented in family law, but necessary given the extraordinary circumstances. Joint custody will be maintained, with Mr. Granger retaining primary physical custody due to Lena's essential role in ongoing humanitarian operations. However, Ms. Patterson will have full access to information about these operations and the opportunity to participate in decisions affecting her daughter's involvement in recovery work. What about my safety concerns? Sarah asked, speaking directly for the first time during the proceedings. The Committee for Holocaust Asset Recovery will provide security briefings and protective services for both parents, Morrison replied. The risks to Lena are significantly greater if she's separated from the recovery network than if she remains under its protection. And if I choose not to participate in these operations, then you'll be choosing to remain ignorant about the most important work your daughter may ever do, Judge Williams said bluntly, but that choice remains yours to make. The hearing concluded with arrangements that satisfied neither conventional custody expectations nor the criminal interests that had initiated the challenge. Sarah would have joint legal custody, but would need to acknowledge the humanitarian importance of Lena's abilities. Elliot would maintain primary physical custody, but would need to include Sarah in decisions about their daughter's future role in recovery operations. Most importantly, Lena would continue living in an environment where her extraordinary abilities could serve historical justice rather than being suppressed in favor of conventional childhood experiences. As they left the courthouse, Sarah approached Elliot with an expression of confused determination. "I need to understand," she said. "I need to see this submarine, meet these people, learn what you and Lena have been doing. I can't make decisions about my daughter's life based on ignorance. And your husband will have to accept that some things are more important than his." Law firm's profit margins. The victory was complete but complex. They had preserved Lena's ability to continue her grandfather's work, exposed the criminal networks that had been manipulating their family, and established legal precedents that would protect other recovery operations from similar interference. But they had also committed themselves to a future where normal family life would always be secondary to humanitarian responsibilities that transcended personal convenience. "Are you ready for that?" Elliot asked his daughter as they walked toward the car. "I've been ready since I first touched the submarine," she replied. "It was waiting for us. Now we get to help it finish waiting." The gold bars would return to their secure storage, awaiting distribution to families whose grandparents had been murdered for their possessions. The memorial list would guide that distribution, ensuring that recovered assets reached survivors rather than collectors. And in a Virginia marsh, a Soviet submarine would continue serving as a monument to the principle that some treasures are too important to remain lost. 6 months later, Elliot stood in the submarine's converted command center, now serving as the headquarters for the Eastern Regional Holocaust Asset Recovery Office. The vessel had been transformed from a hidden relic into a fully operational research facility, complete with climate-controlled archives, satellite communication systems, and secure storage for artifacts awaiting return to their rightful families. The Legacy Fund certificate hanging on the bulkhead represented more than bureaucratic formalization. It was proof that Victor's 40-year mission had achieved its intended purpose. The International Committee for Holocaust Asset Recovery had established a permanent foundation, funded by the recovered gold and dedicated to continuing the work that the descendants had begun in shadow. 17 families so far, Dr. Chen reported during their weekly status meeting. Bank accounts restored, property titles returned, family heirlooms recovered from private collections. The documentation Victor and your father preserved has enabled us to make connections that official. Recovery efforts missed for decades. Lena sat at the navigation table, working on what had become her primary responsibility within the recovery network, analyzing puzzle systems that protected other hidden caches across the world. Her abilities had proven even more remarkable than the committee had hoped. She could recognize patterns in mechanical locks, decode emotional symbolism in safes, and understand the moral logic that guided their creators with an intuitive grasp that trained experts couldn't replicate. "There's another submarine," she announced, studying maps that showed potential locations for additional Operation Poseidon sites. "Somewhere in the Baltic. The patterns match what Grandpa Thomas wrote about secondary repositories." "Are you sure?" Elliot asked, though he'd learned to trust his daughter's insights about the network that had shaped their lives. "The cipher wheel shows coordinates that don't match any known recovery sites. And look," she pointed to notations in Victor's journal that seemed to reference multiple vessels, multiple locations, multiple safes designed to preserve different aspects of the stolen heritage they were working to restore. The revelation that Operation Poseidon extended beyond their Virginia submarine had emerged gradually as they'd worked through the complete archives. Victor hadn't just hidden one treasure. He'd created a comprehensive preservation system spanning multiple countries and decades of careful placement. "How many more?" Katya asked, studying the accumulated evidence with the expertise of someone who'd spent her life understanding her grandfather's methods. "At least 4 additional sites," Chen replied. "Possibly more. Victor's network was more extensive than anyone realized, including the people who've been hunting it." Sarah had become an unexpected asset in the recovery work. Her legal training proved valuable in navigating the complex international law surrounding Holocaust asset claims, and her initial skepticism about the operation's legitimacy had evolved into fierce protective instincts regarding Lena's safety and the moral importance of their work. "The Baltic site will be more dangerous," she observed, studying intelligence reports about current political conditions in the region. "State authorities are less cooperative, criminal networks are better organized, and will be operating without the legal protections we enjoyed in American waters. But the families who lost everything deserve to have their possessions returned," Lena said, with the moral clarity that had guided every decision since they'd first opened Victor's safe. Dangerous doesn't mean impossible. The transformation in their family relationships had been as dramatic as their involvement in international humanitarian work. Sarah's marriage had ended when her husband's connections to theft networks became public, but the divorce had freed her to participate fully in recovery operations without compromising conflicts of interest. "I spent years thinking Elliot was irresponsible," she admitted during one of their planning sessions. "I didn't understand that some responsibilities are too important to be managed through conventional approaches. And now I understand why your father made the choices he made, and why you're making the choices you're making." The Memorial Fund had begun distributing recovered assets to documented survivors and their descendants. Each return carried emotional weight that transcended monetary value. Family photographs discovered in Nazi archives, jewelry that had been worn by grandmothers who died in concentration camps, business documents that proved ownership of properties seized without compensation. "Mrs. Goldstein cried for 20 minutes, Lena reported after their latest return ceremony. "She said she never thought she'd see her mother's wedding ring again." "How did that make you feel?" Elliot asked. "Like we were doing something important? Like all the scary parts were worth it because families were getting their things back?" The committee had offered Elliot a permanent position as regional director for mechanical recovery systems, a role that would utilize his engineering expertise, while allowing him to work closely with Lena as she developed her unique abilities. The salary was sufficient to provide financial stability, but more importantly, the work carried the kind of meaning that his father had found in protecting Victor's legacy. "It means we'll be traveling," he'd explained to Lena when discussing whether to accept the position. "New countries, new languages, new dangers. Are you ready for that kind of life?" "Are you?" she'd asked in return, echoing the conversation they'd had before the custody hearing. "I think I'm becoming ready. I think that's what growing up means. Becoming ready for responsibilities you didn't choose but can't avoid." The submarine itself had become a pilgrimage site for people interested in understanding how individual actions could contribute to historical justice across generations. Visitors came to learn about Victor's sacrifice, Thomas Granger's dedication, and the ongoing work of returning stolen heritage to its rightful owners. "They want to understand how ordinary people can do extraordinary things," Katya explained, as they watched a group of students explore the vessel's converted compartments. "How moral courage can compound across decades to achieve results that governments and international organizations couldn't accomplish." "And what do you tell them?" "I tell them about you and Lena, How desperation and curiosity led to understanding, how understanding led to action, how action led to justice. I tell them that the most important treasures are the ones we preserve for future generations rather than claiming for ourselves. As evening approached and the day's visitors departed, the 3 adults and 1 remarkable child gathered in the torpedo room where Victor's safe stood permanently open, its contents now serving education rather than preservation. The mechanism had become a teaching tool, helping visitors understand the moral reasoning that guided recovery operations and the technical sophistication that protected stolen heritage from further theft. "Sometimes I dream about Grandpa Thomas," Lena said, studying the photographs of Soviet naval officers that still decorated Victor's memorial corner. "He's proud of us. He's proud that we figured out how to open the safe and help families get their things back." "What else does he tell you in these dreams?" Elliot asked. "He says there's more work to do. More submarines, more safes, more families, waiting for their grandparents' things to come home. He says the next adventure will be even more important than this one." Looking at his daughter, confident, compassionate, possessing abilities that could serve humanitarian purposes for decades to come, Elliot felt the weight of legacy that had shaped 3 generations of his family. His father's sacrifice, Victor's dedication, Katya's faithfulness, and now his own commitment to ensuring that stolen things were returned to where they belonged. "Are you ready for more adventures?" he asked Lena. "We're ready," she replied, including their entire makeshift family. In her assessment, "We've always been ready. We just needed to believe in ourselves enough to try." Outside the submarine, night was settling over the salt marsh with the quiet dignity that had protected their secret for 40 years. Inside, emergency lighting cast the same gentle glow that had guided their first exploration of Victor's legacy. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new puzzles, new opportunities to transform discovery into justice. The Baltic submarine awaited their attention, along with other sites that promised to reveal additional chapters in the story of how ordinary people could preserve extraordinary treasures for future generations. But tonight, they were simply a family that had learned to measure wealth not by what they could claim, but by what they could return to its rightful place in the world. The treasure hunt was over. The work of justice would continue for as long as families needed their stolen heritage restored, and children like Lena possessed the courage and compassion to ensure that the right people received what had always belonged to them. In the end, that was the greatest treasure of all, the knowledge that some things are too important to be lost forever.